Alright, so I hope you enjoyed that little video. I hope it made you smile. Basically, the takeaway from that video that I want you to get is summarized on this slide. So, we've already talked about sort of how our understanding of life has come to be. But there's a couple scientists that I want to focus on. So in 1665, microscopes were around. He definitely wasn't the first person to create a microscope, but he was the first person to view cells through a microscope. And like the video said, he did that by slicing up cork and looking at the cork under the microscope. And what he saw were what he termed cells, because they resembled the cells that monks lived in. Now what he was actually viewing was the cell walls of the cork cells, because he was looking at a plant. So he coined the term cell, but it didn't mean what we know it means today when he first coined it. But know who Robert Hooke is, because he's responsible for the term cell. And then the other person we've already talked about, but I want to bring him back in, was Anton van Leeuwenhoek. So just a few years after Robert Hooke, he first viewed protists, yeast, and animal cells. And remember, he called them animalcules. So this did a lot to work at providing evidence that life does not come from nowhere. Now, he didn't disprove the theory of spontaneous generation, but this evidence went against the theory of spontaneous generation, which was where we thought life came from at that time. So to summarize the key points of the cell theory, and you will have to know these: 1, all organisms, and an organism is a living thing, are made of one or more cells. So for something to be living, it has to be made of at least one cell. The cell is the basic unit of structure and organization or function of all living organisms. So it makes up the organism structurally, and that cell carries out basic living functions for that organism. And then the last one, all cells come from existing cells. And there's different ways that that happens depending on how that cell reproduces, but all cells have to come from cells that already exist. So obviously this point came after we had disproved the theory of spontaneous generation. So we'll talk more about that one in Unit 3 when we talk about mitosis and meiosis. But just a couple quick points here. We know that cells are quite small, right? You can't view cells with the naked eye. You have to use a microscope. And some organisms, like bacteria, we're not even going to see any detail in them with our simple compound microscopes. Like, you need an electron microscope to see the organelles or the inside of a prokaryotic cell. So the reason that cells are so small is because we need to maintain a large surface area to volume ratio. So because a cell can only get so big before it's not going to be able to get nutrients to the very inside organelles or get rid of all of its waste, that's going to limit how big the cell can be and still survive. So here's just some math for you. What I want you to focus on is the surface area and the volume. So surface area, one side is 1 times 1 because each unit is each side is 1 unit long, and I have 6 sides, so my surface area is 6. So that's the surface that is covering that cube. And just think of that cube as a cell. Now the volume, length times width times height, is 1, because each of those values is 1. So the surface to volume ratio is 6 to 1. Now if I double the size of that cell, so I'm not going super big here, suddenly the surface area is 24, the volume is only 8. So our ratio drops suddenly to 3 to 1. So I have way more volume now compared to the surface area available, which means I'm not going to be able to bring in nutrients or expel waste very effectively. Now if we split that same box into those 1 by 1 cubes, our surface area to volume ratio goes back down to 6 to 1, which is what we want. We need a large surface area to volume ratio so that cell can maintain homeostasis. So that leads directly into the next slide, being multicellular. So multicellular means being made of more than one cell. Now, multicellular organisms we know are much larger than unicellular organisms, which is a benefit. If you're bigger, less people try to eat you. That is fantastic. Nobody wants to be eaten. So we have multiple cells. Point number 1. We have multiple cells, so if one cell dies, we can replace it and we're still okay. Whereas if you're an amoeba and one cell dies, well, you're now dead, right? That you are that one cell. And then the last benefit to being multicellular is you can have specialized functions in different types of cells, meaning you have groups of cells that have similar jobs. So all your brain cells are neurons, which are different than your liver cells. You can't see this specialization of cells in unicellular organisms because they are one cell. So there are a lot of benefits to being multicellular, but like I said, we're made of many, many, many tiny cells because our cells can be very big. And just one more note before we jump into the actual parts of cells. I'm going to talk lots about structure and function in this lesson. So structure is sort of how it's arranged. We're talking about the anatomy, if you took health science. So where something is in relation to something else in a living organism. Function is the part of the job that it does. So we're talking about the physiology. So what role does it play in your body? Or whatever living organism we're talking about.